Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, and welcome to 2021 Vision Week, day number 3. For those of you who've attended other sessions, welcome back. For those of you who this is your first, welcome. 2021 Vision Week is Modern Sales Pro's week-long event for all things related to annual planning. So whether you're looking for tips and tricks to build your bench, like what we're talking about here this morning, or conversations more about how to design territories or comp plans, we've got a little something for everyone. 2021 Vision Week wouldn't be possible without the sponsorships of these amazing vendors. So a big thank you to the teams at SalesLoft, Concert, IntroHive, Lean Data, Zant, and ZoomInfo. They've helped us pull together the content programs. They've helped us bring on amazing panelists like the folks that we have here today. And they helped us also keep the trains running on time in the Slack channel. So just a few housekeeping notes before we jump into our content here today. For those of you who maybe this is your first time joining an event, please do submit your questions via the question and answer panel. That's going to allow us to best moderate the conversation. These are all very high octane individuals. Helps us point guard and tee up whoever might be the best fit for it. Also, you can comment and upvote other folks' questions. So if there's something in there that you really agree with, or maybe you want to pile in on and say, oh, I'm having that problem too, go ahead and add that context. And then in addition to that, we're going to drop in the chat panel. Please do join the 2021 Vision Week Slack channel. This is where you're going to be able to connect with other folks that are in attendance this week, chat with our panelists, chat with our sponsors, chat with the team at Modern Sales Pros. And that just got dropped in the chat panel there. So without further ado, I want to welcome you all to the final day of really meaty content to Revenue Team Thursday. And this is our first session, and today we're having a digital panel on building your bench and identifying the next generation of leaders in your organization. This is a very important topic as you think about all the conversations that take place. Oftentimes in annual planning, you're thinking about hiring. It's always around hiring. How do I hire enough AEs or SDRs to achieve my goals? Oftentimes, thinking about the development of the people that you already have is maybe forgotten or a secondary priority. When, as you'll find out today, it's a very great way to strengthen the health of your overall team and also build the careers of others, which builds great loyalty and helps you really scale your organization much more effectively. So with that, I'm really excited to have our panelists on today. They all have a ton of experience, and they've all shared amazing stories in our prep session. I'm going to do my best to try to pull that out of our conversation here today. But I'm really excited to introduce first Marcus Knight, the Chief Growth Officer at Black with No Chaser. Marcus, welcome to MSP, and why don't you share a little bit about yourself with the audience?
Hey everyone, Marcus Knight, he, him pronouns, originally from Chicago area and work at Black with No Chaser, which is a Black-owned multimedia organization, telling the stories of Black folks through the lens of Black folks. And yes, there I run the revenue strategy team. So we help Black and Brown founders with their revenue strategy and go-to-market strategy so that they can actually scale their organization. And a pleasure to be on this call. Thank you, Rich, so much.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brooke Julisher. I am the Regional Vice President of Commercial Sales at Salesforce. Originally hail from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but currently residing in Los Angeles, California. Spent a few years at Salesforce and then spent a number of years building and growing teams at a bunch of different high growth startups in all sorts of spaces like Zora, MongoDB, Dialpad, Meltwater, et cetera. So excited to be a part of this today and chat a little bit.
Hey everybody, my name is Kyle Coleman. I'm the VP of Growth and Enablement at Clary. Been at Clary for about 1.5 years now. Originally from Portsmouth, Rhode Island, little town in the smallest state in the Union. Moved out to California and was there for about 6-7 years. Built the SDR team at Looker, a business intelligence data analytics company that ended up being acquired by Google in the summer of 2019. And then I've been at Clary for about 1.5 years now, doing top of funnel demand gen, SDR stuff, as well as enablement stuff. Super excited to talk today. So thanks again, Richard, for having me.
This is exciting. So many amazing, amazing panelists. And Ali Mirza from Rose Garden, he's founder. He won't actually be able to join us here today, but certainly he's a badass in his own right, much like these other folks are. One of the things that's exciting when we were going through this prep session, you've got stories from Kyle, Marcus, and Brooke, and they've all worked at these amazing companies. And Brooke just listed off 3 or 4 where it's like, oh, each one of those was a rocket ship, right? Kyle is, oh, that was a rocket ship too. So these are folks who have real practical, tactical experience, but also have a good sense of the strategy of how to identify that next generation of leaders. So before we jump into this, just one reminder for folks, just please do use the Q&A panel if you have questions. That's going to help us kind of guide the conversation here today. But Kyle, let's start with you. I think in the prep session, you said you had promoted somewhere on the order of 30 or 40 individuals throughout your tenure, which is amazing. When you think about identifying somebody who could become a leader or somebody who's an emerging leader, how do you start that process?
Yeah, it's a great question, Richard. So to put a slightly finer point on that little data point there, at Looker in particular, it was 6 years of just crazy growth, to Richard's point about these kind of rocket ship companies. And what was really great about Looker is we were in Santa Cruz, California, which is not necessarily the most traditional pool of talent in the Bay Area. For those of you who are not aware, there's the Silicon Valley here, and then there's an enormous hill, and then there's Santa Cruz. And people just really don't like commuting over that hill. I did it for 6 years. It wasn't the most pleasant drive in the world, white knuckling the whole time. But what it meant for us is that as we were experiencing this rapid growth, we really did need to look internally first in order to support the growth that we were on. And so it was really important for us to always be keeping an open mind for who those emerging leaders are. And for me, this first bullet point that you see on the slide is always the one that I would go to first when identifying these leaders. And I think over the course of 6 years at Looker, we promoted 11 people from individual SDR roles into an SDR management role. So that's my number for internal graduation. And then here at Clary, we've done the same for 2 individual SDRs into management roles. So I've actually never hired an external manager. I've only ever promoted internally. And this point, what I always look for is people that really have an eye for process and people that gravitate naturally toward helping others. So the people who are always trying to innovate, poking holes, looking at what's working, but not being afraid to tweak, not being afraid to fail, to try new things. And then importantly, when things do work, they're sharing those successes with their teammates. A lot of times, some sales cultures can become a little bit, people feel like there's some zero-sum component to sales. And that's just shouldn't be the case for an emerging leader. They want to take what's working and they want to transmit that to the whole team so that the company is successful. And then similarly, when things aren't working, they need to share that too and be vulnerable. And so people that understand that success and failure is a super important part of understanding process and are willing to go and proactively help people, those are the ones to keep your eye on. Those are the ones who are going to make the most natural transition. And that way, when you promote somebody, the rest of the team isn't shocked by that decision. The rest of the team is like, oh yeah, that makes sense. They're all over it. They're helping me out every day.
I think that's a great point where it isn't a zero-sum game. And also, fun fact about Santa Cruz for those of you, because this is Vision Week, we've got an 80s theme. For those of you who've seen Lost Boys, shot in Santa Cruz. So there's an 80s fun fact for everybody. Again, that's the last one I got. I got nothing else after that, Brooke. I'm sorry. But Brooke, when we were doing our prep, you had mentioned this a lot. There's a couple key themes, right? That ownership component. How did you, throughout all those rocket ships you've been on, identify some of the emerging leaders?
Yeah, so we did a lot of things really well. We also made a lot of mistakes along the way to learn from. And so I think a couple of things. First and foremost, people need to sort of flock to that person or look at them as a leader. You know, you're not really leading anyone if no one's following you, and everyone can do that in their own right. There's various ways to be a leader, but people have to be naturally inclined to go to that person for help or have the ability to, you know, learn from them. So I think that that's one big area. Another area is having a repeatable process for success that they understand. So if you're going to take what you know, like if somebody's really good, but they don't really know how, or they don't know how to translate it to somebody else, all that knowledge is just going to stay in their head. And they might be a wonderful individual contributor and a snowflake, but at the end of the day, they're not going to be able to repeat that process across multiple people and transfer that knowledge to somebody else. So I think, you know, really understanding and having ownership over their process, and then being able to translate that that to other people is really important. And then I think one other thing that's that we don't talk about enough, and we made this mistake across a lot of companies, is do they actually want to be in leadership, and do they know what that means? The worst thing you can possibly do, and we always talk about this, or I always talk about this of like rock stars and superstars. Your rock stars are your people that are really good in their job. They know it really well. They're in your upper quadrant, and that's what they want to do. They don't have the need to push themselves further in that way. They don't have the need to try and extend, and they don't have those wants towards the things that you need to love to do in management and leadership in order to be successful at it. And then you have your superstars who just want to keep going up and to the right. And different people can be at different places in various points in their lives, but really making sure that you are understanding what it takes to be a leader, that information is being sort of digested, and you're understanding if that's the right role for that person.
I think that's an often overlooked point, right? We say, "Oh, cool, you're doing great. Let's promote you." And Marcus, I know you've got you've been through that kind of on the bad end before, right? Promoting maybe a top rep that wasn't totally the right fit.
Yeah. So to Brooke's point, like knowledge sharing and acting as if you are in that role ahead of time is very, very important. Like that's going to let me know that like, okay, you are primed, or you are almost ready for that next leap. But yes, when it comes to the common pitfalls, oftentimes it is the top rep that we want to promote because they are so good at what they do, but there are still some leadership kind of gaps that are missing. And so I've made that mistake a few times. And honestly, that's the one thing that I look out for now is like, okay, just because they are a top rep, do they have the desire to move into management? One, how can we coach them so that it makes the most sense, and not just throw them into the fire and have them fail right away?
I think that's a common trope that we hear oftentimes in sales. Oh, we'll just promote the top rep, and that person will be fine. And I want to pull out a little bit of a thread here that you've all hit on, this notion of leadership and management. And I know we'll talk about this a little bit more as we dive in, but the notion of you can lead without being a people manager, and it happens all the time. And that's, I think, a fundamental characteristic that you each mentioned, where this is somebody who others would gravitate to, whether for charisma, whether because they're a strong mentor or otherwise. And I think that's an important point for folks as they look at their bench strength. Who's leading today that maybe isn't a manager? Question coming in live from Chelsea Langan. And Brooke, let's start with you on this one. And then certainly Kyle and Marcus, feel free to weigh in. How would you evaluate an individual who's really, really strong on the process front and great on mentoring, but maybe not the strongest closer? Like they're not like a top rep style performer. How would you think about that person with regards to building your bench?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and not everyone's going to be great at everything. So what I would say in the beginning is look at the key criteria and the must-haves to move someone from, or the key criteria must-haves for someone to be in leadership, whether that person's an external promotion or an internal promotion. And then I would look at what are the non-negotiables, what are the things that are the absolute must-haves as your baseline framework. And if being a strong closer is one of them, based on the fact that how the role exists and what the manager needs to do in order to help the team be successful, then you can evaluate against that. And then if not, I look at everything as a sliding scale. If their sort of capacity to learn and aptitude is really high and really strong, but their skill set in your given field is low, well, that kind of offsets itself because you know that they can come up to speed quickly. If your team has a lot of really strong closers on it already, but really needs a lot around process or whatever else, you can look at that as a sliding scale or areas that you can step in. So I think be specific about your criteria and your must-haves, and promoting somebody too soon, I think, is one of the biggest pitfalls in promoting. It's usually when, people feel like they're really past that point and they're almost like bored and frustrated in their current role. That's probably when they're actually ready. So I would say slow it down to make sure that you set them up for success.
I couldn't agree more with what Brooke just outlined there. And I think the way that I think about it and the way that I present it to everybody that I work with internally is that in order to progress career development, there's kind of two things that have to happen. One is your individual readiness, and the other is company need. And it's not until those circles overlap that you're actually going to be able to make a move. So exactly what Brooke said, if the team needs a manager who's a super closer, because that's what the team needs, that's the company need, and that individual's not ready, then those circles aren't overlapping yet. And you just need to be honest with that person to say, like, look, you're really strong on process, you're really strong on XYZ, and you're next in line for when we need this. In the meantime, we're going to work on those gaps that exist right now. And that way, hopefully we can just accelerate when these circles overlap and your readiness matches the company need. And that's where it is. And it'd be very interesting to get that person's reaction to that, because their reaction to that will tell you a lot about their capacity for leadership. And just before I kick it over to Marcus, I want to make a tangential point, which is that in my opinion, leadership is a mindset and management is a title. And that's a pretty useful dichotomy, I think, for how to think about things. So I won't expand on that anymore, but I'll kick it over now to you, Marcus.
Wow, those are some amazing gems, and I couldn't agree more with Brooke and Kyle. Yeah, like I am first evaluating for the company need in that role, and then I'm going to fill the skill set as closely aligned as I possibly can. What I can do later on is find someone to kind of to supplement the gaps of the skill set in another hire. So I'm looking for the immediate need right now, and then eventually then I'll bring in someone else or promote someone else that has to fill those gaps.
I think that's a really important first principle and this has come up a lot in discussions on MSP as well, but Brooke and Kyle and Marcus, you all mentioned it. What need are you trying to fill as an organization, and making sure that you understand the trade-offs that you're making with anyone you're thinking about promoting here. I want to keep us going here. Folks, keep the questions coming. That was phenomenal. Please do. We've got these amazing panelists here. So we've got this emerging leader identified. We kind of have a sense of what, this is what he or she is up to. Brooke, how do you create opportunities for growth for those emerging leaders, maybe before they're in seat as a manager, as a leader in the organization?
Yeah, I think the preparation leading up to the promotion is the most important. So one big thing to do is a lot of people have one-on-ones with their team, but it's a lot around forecast and pipeline and blocking and tackling stuff. What I always try and do with somebody who is within that, year, 6 months to 18 months of being promoted, depending on how long your cycles are of that, is I start doing career development one-on-ones. And we look at a framework of, hey, here's all the things that you're really strong at. Here's some of the areas that we want to continue to develop, either because they're just areas that could use a little bit more cultivating, or they're areas that you're going to need for the next role that you just don't necessarily have to exercise those muscles today. And we'll talk about them. We'll create tasks based off them. I'll give them opportunities to step in and do some sort of leadership-esque activities that are representing those skill sets with those roles. And then I also give them opportunities to showcase themselves to the team or broader organization, and just try and give them a little bit more of that platform. The other big thing I think that's important is starting to have them have mentors, if they don't already, sort of outside of myself, but in a leadership role that they want to be. So I think we'll go into this later, but everyone tries to figure themselves out when they first step into a leadership role, like, who am I and can I be myself? And I think learning and seeing how other people do it is really important for them to find their own voice.
I think those are great points, Brooke. And if I can just ask one clarifying question to make sure folks really got that, is that when you say one-on-ones focused on career development, is that in addition to your regular tactical one-on-ones, or is that just, it's an agenda topic? How do those actually work?
Yeah, it's separate for sure, because ultimately, even with everyone's best efforts, one of the two of you is going to end up diving into deals. And so I even title them differently. Sometimes I will skip a weekly one-on-one with them that week if I feel like, right, they're strong, their forecast is always up to date, their things are always good, and I'll make that the every other. But other times I'll just add it as a separate, but I think it needs to be separate.
That's a great point of clarification, right? So it doesn't get paved over with, oh, hold on, what's the status of, Adidas or whatever. Marcus, I know that you had a strong culture of this and getting folks ready for their next role. How did you go about it? How do you kind of advise folks to go about it today?
Yeah, a lot of what Brooke said, I've implemented as well. I also do like a evaluation where I will evaluate the individual skill sets, as well as have them doing a self-evaluation as well, and see if there is some overlap and where we can actually progress certain skill sets. But I like the 80-20 rule, which is 80% of the time you are doing your current role and 20% you are growing in that career development stage. And that is, right along with myself or another leader along the way, maybe on top of their current day job, they are getting some of those tasks that maybe I would handle. And then again, also looking at mentorship outside of just myself. So looking for external mentorship to help guide them a bit more. Those are kind of like the main pieces for me when it comes to that development, is that 80-20 is important so that they can get a sense of how to operate and how to act in that role. And then they can dive into specific questions. Once they've done it for a while, then they will have very pointed questions that in order to grow their skill set.
I totally agree. I wish I could disagree with any of this. I hope it's not a boring conversation for that reason, but it's spot on, Marcus and Brooke. I'll hit on the third bullet point here, which is what I think is one of the most important traits in any effective leader, and self-awareness. And this is especially true for people that are emerging leaders, because they need to understand inherently what their strengths are and what their weaknesses are. At the very least, they need to be willing to understand that if you point those things out to them. And then the two questions I ask are, if you understand your strengths, what are you doing to teach or train other people on those strengths so they can be similarly effective in the way that you are? And then the second question is your weaknesses. Do you understand what your weaknesses are, and what can you do? What can we do together to shore up those weaknesses? And if they can answer those questions effectively, and I think that forum that Brooke mentioned is a perfect place to do it, that bi-weekly or maybe even monthly sort of career coaching conversations, separate from the day-to-day, separate from tactics, separate from quota attainment, like truly focused on their career development. If you're focusing on those two things, their strengths and how they're manifesting across the org, their weaknesses and what they're doing individually to shore them up, I think that's a really good framework for understanding how serious somebody is about becoming a leader.
I think that those are really great points. And I think there's also a question that can happen here where maybe I think I'm ready and I'm not quite. And Kyle, you mentioned self-awareness. That's one of the hardest things to train somebody on. It's and you know it when you see it, but sometimes it's really difficult. How have you trained some folks, especially with more junior folks, that self-awareness? How have you fostered that sense to be able to enable that conversation?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's different for everybody. Marcus, I know we talked a little bit previously about how coachable people are, how willing they are to take feedback, how willing they are to ask for feedback is another really important point. And that little paradigm alone tells you so much about how willing somebody is to really be introspective and really be aware. And then there are other things, just seeing how they're interacting with teammates during team meetings, things like that, like understanding, are they the type of person who is stirring the pot, or are they the type of person who's calming things down? And obviously you want the latter. You don't want the former in any of your leaders. And then I want to go back to something that Brooke said to open up her response to this initial question, which is that you really need to make sure that these people want to be leaders. And I know we just posted in the chat here a few questions that I've found particularly useful to understand somebody's true interest in the role. If their answer to why do you want to be a leader is because they want the money or they want the title, probably not good enough. Like, they need to have a much more robust answer about how this position is fulfilling intrinsic motivators that they have, is fulfilling experiences that they're hoping to get, is in service of some longer term goal that they have for themselves. They really need to be able to articulate that, and their answers to those questions. And I literally, if you click that link, you'll see 7 questions. I literally make people write answers, like a couple paragraphs per question to each one of these questions, to really force them to be self-aware. And if they don't take the exercise seriously, or if they come back and it's a half-hearted effort, then it's back to the drawing board and we continue working on it until they develop this true means for self-awareness.
So hold on, Kyle. You're saying that as a manager, you don't make more money and don't have more power with the title? Are you sure about that? That's not what I heard.
I'm 100% sure, sir.
All right, Brooke, I cut you off there.
No, all good. I completely agree with Kyle. I think figuring out self-awareness and helping people to, again, exercise a muscle that they might not have needed to exercise at any point, like meaningfully in their life today, is really important, because empathy needs to go down really easily, but it often doesn't go up. And so if that person isn't able to sort of pivot and change course or take a step back and self-evaluate, one, it's going to be really hard for them to get that empathy from other people based on just the output, like the vibe that they put out. But then also I think it's gonna be really hard for them to evaluate other people in that way. And so again, you can go back to like, what are the key framework for the criteria that you're looking for those roles, or what are the core competencies? And then make a framework to ask them questions around, how do they rate themselves against those core competencies? What's an example of what they do really well? And one question I always ask in interviews that just totally trips people up is like, what do you think your biggest strength is? Not like, I'm really good at prospecting, but innate characteristic that makes you really strong in sales. And then what do you think your biggest weakness is? And it's really interesting, especially like getting them to think about a innate characteristic versus a tactical output, for one. And then the second thing is, people feel like if they say something negative about themselves, like in an interview, they're not going to get the job. And, or you get something that's like, oh, negative, but a positive. And then following that up with, okay, how does that negatively impact you or the people you work with? And it sends this like shockwave through people. And so I think just finding opportunities to ask questions that force them to think and force them to evaluate themselves and make them sit in that discomfort, will help them grow and help them become a lot more self-aware.
I think that those are phenomenal points there, Brooke. And one question, and I want to put you on the spot on this one, Brooke. You mentioned before that career development one-on-one. I actually want to come back to that a little bit. In those conversations, have you found that folks realize that they actually don't want to be a manager? When they're like, oh, and that seems like that's something to celebrate, right?
Oh my gosh, yes. And I'm the most honest. Like I lay it all out there. I don't sugarcoat anything, because I love seeing the people that I've promoted in their career and where they are today. And some of them will still come back for advice, and some of them are now in these amazing positions. And that's the kind of impact that I want to leave on the people that work for me and are promoted. The last thing I want to do is lose somebody amazing because you didn't set them up for success by putting them in a role that's not suited for them. And so I have conversations even with some of my team now, like they think they might want you. And I'm like, let's lay it out there. Let's have an honest conversation. Like, what do you think it is? What are your biggest areas of concern? What do you want to know? And I think it's the best thing you can do for yourself, and the people on your team.
Yeah, I think that's a great icing on the top, right? Management's not necessarily something that everybody has to do. And I think that's the great part about sales too. You can make a whole heck of a lot of money not leading a team, and probably have a whole heck of a lot less heartache, frustration, and otherwise if it's not the right fit for you. So I wanted to move on here, and I wanted to talk about a scenario that we see a lot in sales. And I wanted to talk about the transition and helping folks as they transition from the peer to a manager, right? So this is super, super common. You were one of the best reps. Now you're the manager. The people you were out with for beers last week are now working for you. Marcus, I know that you've had a couple scenarios where this worked really well, a couple where maybe you missed the mark a little bit. What advice would you give to folks that are helping someone manage this transition from peer to manager or to lead?
Yeah, so I think I've successfully had this happen. I've also been unsuccessful in some of my efforts as well too. So what I've landed on is this notion where the manager leads the check-ins with the team, their peer, who they were just peers with, but now are going to be managing. But more so, just like having a vulnerable and real type conversation around on like how they're going to be able to support the team, each individual on that team, and also just giving them a chance, giving the rest of the team individually a chance to kind of like open up a little bit more as to maybe their frustrations and things of that nature. I typically sit in those rooms sometimes as well, just to make sure that like I'm able to kind of guide that manager a bit, because they are just starting out in this new role. So I'm guiding them a bit as far as how that conversation should go and take form, and how they kind of lead in that scenario.
I think that's a great point. And Kyle, I know you've been a part of this and you've seen it work and seen it not work. What advice do you have for folks that are helping maybe manage that peer to manager transition?
Yeah, as much as I would love to steal the third bullet point here, I can't do that in good faith because this is Brooke's point and I'll let her speak to it. So I'll focus on the fourth bullet point, which is a really important distinction between sponsorship and mentorship. And this was a point that an SDR manager at Sixth Sense, his name is Ernest, he brought this up in a conversation I was on with him recently. And I think it's a super important point, which is you want to mentor somebody, as we've talked about to this point. You want to do the coaching, you want to do the career development, of course, to get them into the role. But what a lot of people do is they say, okay, you got your management position, everybody's happy now, good luck, see you later. And that it's a disservice to them during this transition period, because just because they got the role doesn't mean everybody else on the team understands the work that went into them having achieved this new position. And so you really need to focus on sponsoring them through the transition and being, as Marcus said, being in the room and deferring to them when somebody has questions, or, you know, when you're on the sales floor, pointing to them and saying they're the one that you need to go to when you need help, when you need assistance. And you need to, you as, you know, perhaps the prior manager or somebody who has a little bit more seniority on the team, you need to be the one who's putting them in a position to be a leader. You need to sponsor them throughout that transition and beyond. And if you can really do that and make a point to do that, you will see, I think, a more accelerated sort of transition for them and for the team to think of them as leaders.
I think it's like the age-old scene in the Godfather when the transition happens and they go to the Godfather and they say, "Godfather, help us." And he's like, "I'm not the boss anymore. You got to talk to Michael." That is not an 80s movie reference. So sorry about that.
Great reference.
Yeah, I think, I mean, all really good points. And the only things to just touch on and then add is, one, if you're giving them a lot of opportunities to have that platform ahead of time and you're pumping up the things that they've done, I think it's a really natural next step, and the team expects it to come and is sort of proud of that transition because of, you know, how you've showcased what they've done in order to get there along the way. So I think part of it is the lead up and what you do as a leader to put them in a position to be seen as that. The second thing, right, is act as if for that person. You need to start guiding them and coaching them now in their current role, that, you know, they're not going to be the ones to like not do whatever they were supposed to be doing or be talking on the side or whatever. So they need to be leading by example and doing the right thing. One of the things that I always talk to my team about, and this is what Kyle was mentioning, is like, as a manager, you can watch the roller coaster, but you cannot get on it. Right? All those crazy ups and downs of sales and like the highs and lows in your stomach, you know, going everywhere. Like, that is one of the biggest differences. And one of the biggest things that they can step in to do right away is be that neutral, cool, calm, collected, always level-headed person when everybody else is riding the roller coaster. So I think that that's really big. I think the last thing has a lot to do with just making an impact immediately. So I've started at a lot of companies where I started in a leadership position, and I might be managing people that are 10 years my senior, might have 15 years more sales experience than I do. And so what I need to do is come in and figure out, how do I earn trust and respect and earn credibility? And by making an impact and teaching somebody something that they didn't already know, or stepping in a way that really supported them. And it's no different from somebody taking a step up internally at a company. Like, I mean, to be blunt, I would say, like, prove your worth, right? You got to prove your worth in that role, make an impact, and, you know, be helpful to people, but also do it in a way that is authentic to yourself, and avoid that imposter syndrome of like, oh, I'm not supposed to be here. Well, if I don't act like this, no one will respect me as a manager. And so just, I think having, and then as the leader, letting them in, giving them that space to do it. And I think, you know, Kyle and Marcus both touched on the fact of like making sure you're sort of monitoring and aware of what's going on. Don't overstep because you need people to go to that person, but, you know, help them along a few times so they don't fall too hard.
I think that you also made a point earlier, Brooke, and I'd love for you to elaborate a little bit more on this, as you mentioned this notion of empathy and kind of empathy up and empathy down. I think it's often a challenge, right? So how do you kind of foster that as someone's going through this transition?
Yeah. One, I think being really candid with them ahead of time. You go back to like the honest conversations that you have with people, and talk to them about some of the struggles that you've gone through with that, and some of the things that you've done in order to try and help people understand more. One of the biggest and easiest ways to, you know, get empathy up to, one, get them ready for it. But then in order to get empathy and really be able to manage those situations, I think there's a level of like honesty and transparency that needs to happen between the teams, and not getting this like, I'm now the leader, and so everybody needs to listen to what I say, but explaining the why behind things and why it matters and why it's important and what it's going to do, I think helps a lot of people understand where you're coming from. And then just being vulnerable and being open and like just being honest can help do that. But it's going to be one of the biggest kicks to the gut for somebody when, nobody really cares about their feelings, but everybody else's feelings need to be cared about. And so it's a real change.
It's something where I think it's a great point. And before we go to a bunch of questions coming in here, folks, please do keep those coming. We're going to get to those in a second. But I think one of the points back to is the person ready for management? Not to sound poor us as leaders, but it is oftentimes a very lonely position. It is oftentimes a very thankless position. And if you don't have, to Kyle's point before, a really strong desire to help others and to grow others, and you feel very fulfilled from that, it's going to be a very, very rough run of it. We got a bunch of great questions coming in here, and we're going to move on to live Q&A. Marcus, let's start with you for this one. I'm going to paraphrase here, but organizations sometimes have, some kiss asses, and those are the folks who get promoted instead of people who are maybe better qualified for roles. How, if you're an employee at a company like that, what have you seen, or what would you advise somebody to do to help make that a little bit more bearable?
Yeah, so I am always looking for people that are leading with curiosity, that are challenging kind of the way that business is operating, but in a healthy way, not in just like a combative way. Someone that can actually say like, okay, why did we come up with this type of strategy, et cetera? The people that are, we call them kiss asses, if you will, that get promoted, they typically don't last very long. And I've been in environments where that has happened. And it's like, okay, I've seen that they've been promoted, but instead of there being like just one promotion, I've actually seen it be two people promoted at the same time, one being a kiss ass, if you will, and one actually doing the work. And very early on, you saw the delta just happen between the two as far as their team success. And so for me, I'm always looking for leading with curiosity, challenging leadership and your peers to be better, and then coming up with solutions and being able to work in a collaborative type environment, as opposed to just like, you know what, I'm the best rep, I'm going to take this on, I'm going to do it myself. So when you have those type of traits within individuals, then it will be kind of clear that is the direction that the sales team should head in and for actual success.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Marcus. And I've been lucky enough to work at a couple companies who have really embodied the servant leadership sort of mindset, which is to say the managers at the company are working for the individuals on the team and not the other way around. And so if somebody is presenting themselves, an aspiring manager, an aspiring leader is presenting themselves as a kiss ass who is trying to impress up instead of impress down, or, to their future teammates, that is a major red flag. And basically I can nip it in the bud pretty easily before even transitioning them, saying like, I think you're in this for the wrong reason. Like, yeah, I'm impressed by your results. You're obviously doing a good job managing up, but are you really currying the favor of the people that you're going to be managing? How much respect do they have for you? How much are you helping them? How much of your time right now is spent helping them instead of trying to curry favor up? So just embodying that mindset early, building it into the coaching plan, the development plan is super important. And that hopefully, obviously easier said than done, but hopefully that will allow you to avoid those sorts of situations at your company.
I think this is a great point. And I want to get to the questions. Please do keep those coming in. But actually, Kyle, I want to reflect back something on you. Servant leadership, is that a newer philosophy you've seen adopted in sales? I feel like sales for a long time was that Wolf of Wall Street culture, especially as folks transition from maybe on-prem software selling into perpetual license SaaS space. Do you think that servant leadership is a newer sort of discipline or mindset in sales, or have you seen that kind of throughout your career?
So I think a little bit of both, because I'm still relatively early in my career. So I'm not exactly sure what the sales cultures were like 25 years ago, because I was in fourth grade. But I think that I do think that it was sort of a, I always chalked it up to being in Santa Cruz, and Santa Cruz culture itself being a little bit softer, let's say a little bit more on the hippie spectrum, which was useful because it really meant that we liked each other, and we were hiring people that liked to work with one another, and we're hiring leaders that were in it not for their own success or glamour, but really in it to help other people. And it starts at the top. This was, again, I've been fortunate enough to work at two companies now whose CEOs and founders really embody this mindset and care way more about the happiness of the individuals than they care about the success of the company, and know that the two are not mutually exclusive, obviously, and happy employees often yield the most successful companies. So I don't know how new it is. I'd have to defer to some people who've been around the block a little bit more, but it's certainly gaining popularity, at least in the conversations I'm having.
Yeah, no, I believe it. It feels like it's cosmically like the right way to do things, especially as we move forward into this uncertain time, or whatever you want to call it. So great question coming in from Slack. And Brooke, I want to start with you on this, just because you mentioned so many amazing rocket ships that you were on. Question from Slack is, we're all at companies, they're moving so freaking fast. Career development sometimes falls by the wayside. Maybe we're too busy, or that one-on-one gets paved over because we have to talk about that deal today. How do you, as a leader, make sure that you carve out time for that and ensure that career development does happen?
Yeah. So first and foremost, you have to think it's as important as forecasting, closing deals, and pipeline. If you don't put it on your core priorities and put actionable goals on it and measure yourself against it, you're not going to do it. Just like you wouldn't do if you didn't schedule your workouts or whatever other thing in your life that you try and have, strong goals towards. So I would say that's number one, is like, make it a core, one of your core pillars for how you measure yourself being successful. Because, by the way, that's how your bosses are going to measure your success. It's not just about forecasting. It's about how many people you're able to bring up, how many people you can promote, what kind of team you can build. So it's a key pillar. So I think one is just prioritizing that time. Two, creating like an operational cadence for it. Again, just like you would your pipeline, or just like you would your forecasting with your team. And then I would also say, last but not least, to put some of the responsibility down as well. You can do it up if it helps and if you want to, but I think empowering your team to take some of the responsibility to drive their future helps eliminate a culture where it's like, well, you didn't do this, well, you didn't do that, and putting everything on your shoulders, because it's really easy for us, because we have the leadership title, to think that we have to take on everything. But like, I had a boss that used to say, like, we're going to help our customers participate in their own rescue. We'll help your team participate in their own rescue or their own success by making sure that they are as involved and they're doing as much proactively as they can. And so I would say, put some of the tasks down to them for either scheduling or finding a mentor or whatever else that would be, to make sure that that's in there. And then the last thing is just to help with the mindset, is like, if you look at the tasks that you're probably putting ahead of cultivating a career, they're probably tactical things that are point in time and maybe only helping like one deal or one situation. Whereas if you take a step back and you focus a little bit more broadly on a topic or something that's going to help them improve in general, you're going to eliminate a lot more off your plate sooner, because that person's going to become more self-sufficient in those areas that you're constantly needing to hit each time with each task.
It's something, it's funny that you mentioned this. We talked about this a little bit yesterday when we were talking about building great messaging, right? How do you give people great first principles to think about what good messaging looks like? It's the same thing. How do I give you tools or frameworks to help you think about your career, versus saying, oh, Marcus, you're an SDR, you should be an SDR manager. Do these things, don't do these things, and you'll be an SDR manager. And then Marcus is like, what the heck just happened? Bunch of questions coming in here in Slack. Keep these coming, folks. We've got our panelists here for about another 10 minutes. Kyle, let's start with you on this one. So oftentimes in small organizations, like official promotions, whether it's financial or structural, aren't an option, right? How are some tips or tricks or things that you've seen work where you can encourage natural leadership and grow individuals in their current role before you can make those sort of official promotions or financial promotions?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tori. It is a callback to something I mentioned earlier, which is that person may be ready to make a move, but if the company need isn't there yet, then there's not going to be any sort of movement. And so we're talking now about where company need doesn't exist. And so the first point is transparency. And this is true about any person who's trying to make any sort of internal move. You just have to be as transparent and honest with them as possible and convey as much context around the rationale as possible so that they understand it's not a personal thing, it's a company thing, it's a company strategy thing. And you need to explain to them what the benchmarks are that your company is trying to achieve in order to unlock that headcount, to unlock that growth, that extra, the people on the team that would then necessitate a manager, or the extra revenue that would allow for an increase in comp or something like that. And you just need to tell them all of those things. And in that conversation where you're communicating that context, you're setting that stage, you're being transparent, you are developing them to be a future leader. Because in all likelihood, if they stick around long enough, obviously, to kind of grow with the company, they're going to be having that same conversation with the rock star, superstar, emerging leader that they're managing soon enough. So give them that wide aperture about how the company is making decisions, how the department is making decisions, and not just about how they should be thinking about their own personal growth, but their growth within the context of what the company needs. And that hopefully will allow them to see things a little bit differently, think a little bit differently, and therefore to continue to create a coaching plan that's useful for them and aligns with the timeline that your company has.
I think that's a phenomenal, like, adult conversation to have with somebody who's eager to be a leader. Like, hey, this is why our business operates this way. These are the types of conversations you're going to have. I really, really like that point. I'm going to throw this one up, and I just want each of our panelists to weigh in on this. Should be a quick one. What's everyone's number one quality that you look for in emerging leaders? So we talked about a lot of different things, but really, what's one characteristic you look for in emerging leaders? And Marcus, we'll start with you on this. I think I know what yours is going to be, but I want to see if I'm right.
I'm like, well, I don't even know what mine is going to be right now. So here we go.
No pressure.
No, I think that I think I stated it earlier, but curiosity, like leading with curiosity is the one that I think is the most important, because that way, like they'll continuously learn. They are if you're leading with curiosity, then you're thinking of things in terms of like systems and processes, as opposed to just like individual kind of assignments. And so for me, that'd be the number one characteristic.
Awesome. Brooke?
It's hard to pick one, but probably self-awareness. There's things that are coachable, and then there's things that are not coachable, and there's things that are really hard to coach. And I think being able to be self-aware leads to empathy. It leads to, being at like that leader. And it's a really hard thing to coach.
I will say selflessness is extremely important. Every single effective manager and leader that I've promoted internally has cared way more about the success of the people on their team than their own individual success, and gets into management in order to make other people successful and not to worry about the glitz and glamour that you get, the accolades that you get when you're a manager. And you see that too when they're managing and their team is doing something well, or a member of their team does something well. The sort of reflex from the executive team is to say, hey, Kyle, great job. Your SDR team is doing a great job. I'm like, no. I'm not doing the job. It's Marley who deserves the credit. Like, let's go talk to her, like give her a call and congratulate her on that thing. And so selflessness, I think, is extremely important.
I think there's a good sports analogy too in that, Kyle, for folks that have seen, really great coaches. When the team does well, it's the coach goes, no, I just put the game plan together. They did all the hard work. And if the team, loses, the coach is always, that was me. I didn't put the players in a position to succeed. I think that's a really, really great point. There's obviously some uncertainty in the world that we're in, pandemic life, however you want to say it. Things are changing if you hadn't noticed. Question coming in from Hannah, how do you think that this has changed, or these principles have changed because we're remote for really, till who knows when, hopefully not much longer, but for the foreseeable future? And Brooke, let's start with you on this one.
Yeah, so I don't think that being remote changes what you look for in a leader who's ready to be promoted. But I do think it makes it more important for someone to be able to be introspective and take some reflections. Like, I'll give my own personal story. I'm a very direct, straightforward person. I'm from Philadelphia. Like, it's just the way that I am. But my team knows that no matter what, I have their back. I would run through walls for them. Like, we develop a great relationship because we truly get to know each other. And we have, we're not in the office every day because they're enterprise sales reps, but when we get together, we share stories and everything else. And in the first couple months of the pandemic, with everything going on and everything being really crazy, and you're on in and out of Zoom calls, I didn't have that opportunity to have those sidebars and just sort of chit chat conversation or happy hours or whatever it is with the team to keep that. And I found myself coming in and out and in and out. And I had to take a step back and be like, whoa, because my natural inclination isn't always towards these things, I need to be even more conscious of them during this time to make sure that I stay well-rounded with my team, because it's always this delicate balance. So I would say you don't change the qualities of that person, but just make sure that as proactive as possible as their leader, you're encouraging them to think about those things and making sure that they maintain that balance when certain things are no longer available to them.
The other thing I want to just add there as well is that making sure that they can do activities or things to keep the team to gel together as well was something that I've kind of had to work with during these times. Is like, okay, how do my managers, how do my reps keep the team kind of dynamic together when we are so far apart and not in an office together? And we've done some really cool creative things in order to make that happen, which has been really, really interesting. But that has shown me like, okay, great, they are actually ready to take the next level, because now they are thinking about this from, if we're going to be stuck in this new norm, then how do we scale in this new norm as well?
I think we've all seen that. And back in person, if your organization was big enough, maybe you had the culture czar or all different sorts of silly, the person who's bringing the fun to the situation. A bunch of questions here. We're going to take, this is going to be our final live question, and then we'll go to our panelists for a wrap here. Kyle, let's start with you on this one. What self-development resources or courses or books would you recommend for folks that are looking to prepare for a leadership role?
Yeah, it's a good question. A couple books that I've found particularly useful are Radical Candor by Kim Scott, like number one. And Brooke, you've used some of the verbiage throughout this presentation. So Radical Candor is a Bible. I read it every year, and I take something new away every year. And often when I'm rereading it, I'm like, I can't believe I forgot this thing. Like, Jesus. So Radical Candor, number one, far and away. Number two is Extreme Ownership by a couple Navy SEALs. Really interesting sort of parallels between their time as Navy SEALs and then business sorts of leadership roles. So those two books are, I think, at the top of the heap. Masterclass.com is a pretty cool little sort of self-guided learning system where they have a few different courses that are taught by some pretty heavy hitters in the business world. The former CEO of Starbucks, the former CEO of Disney, a couple other ones that you just get some good takeaways from there. So Masterclass is a good one. But I want to say, and this is super important for anything, like you can read and you can consume all the content you want, but if you're not actually like a practitioner of what you're learning, then you're not actually learning. And so invest in yourself to like really work with a coach in some way and like do some role playing stuff, put yourself in those scenarios, even if they're, imagined role playing scenarios. It's super, super valuable to actually practice some of the things that you're learning. Otherwise, it's just in one ear and out the other. So you can read and watch and view all you want, but find ways to actually put those things into practice in real life.
Yeah, and to piggyback off what Kyle said, like practical experience and like learning kind of the role itself is by far the best in my opinion. Some books that I tend to have my teams read, and I've stolen this from Pete Kazanji, because why not? But The Goal by Elihu Goldratt is one of my favorites. I mean, it taught me so much in regards to thinking about scaling its systems and processes. So that's always one that I read. And then now I'll reading Pete's Founding Sales book. So.
I think there's a lot of phenomenal resources on this. The other one I would recommend, because I'm a old school book nerd, Peter Drucker is like the oldest of the OG Harvard Business School information worker researchers. He wrote a book called The Effective Executive. And it goes in extensively into time management. And when you're a manager, your time is the highest leverage thing that you don't get more of. And it's an important thing where folks oftentimes, if they have the soft skills, maybe their strength is they care a lot, but if you care too much and don't manage your time and your energy effectively, so I would recommend that as well. But to Kyle's point, it's all about the practical application here. So we're almost at time, folks. A lot of amazing conversations here today. I'm going to challenge each one of our panelists to try to summarize everything that they want the audience to take away in a tweet. Not a LinkedIn post, not a Medium post, but really just think of tweet length, one or two things that you want our audience to take away from today. And this is always the hardest part, but I think it's the funnest part of this. Like, what's the key here? And Marcus, let's start with you on this. Just a tweet length takeaway for our audience here today.
Don't be afraid to fail. Like, continuous learning is real, and we are going to fail initially in our roles and when we get there. But that's okay. We're learning from all of that. So fail and fail often and fail fast.
Thank you, Marcus. Kyle?
That's so solid. Mine will be, I guess, a little bit more for this, the topic of how to think about emerging leaders. And I think if you take nothing else away, I'd like you to remember that the focus on the coaching plan and the development is extremely important. So as Brooke said, schedule that time separately to do that coaching and development. And remember that your coaching and your development of that person does not stop once they achieve the role. You need to sponsor them through that transition and through their first couple of quarters and years, probably even in that leadership role, to really cement them and give them confidence.
I would say operationalize your process for cultivating talent like you would your pipeline.
I think that's the great takeaways, amazing panelists, a great conversation here today. Kyle, Brooke, Marcus, I know you're super, super busy. Thank you so much for taking an hour out of your day and sharing your amazing stories and insights with the audience here at Vision Week. On behalf of the 20,000 and growing folks in the Modern Sales Pros community, everybody who joined us here today and watching the recording in the future, I really do want to thank you. This was awesome, awesome, awesome content. And I hope you all stay safe and have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.